I'm going to kick this off. Hello and welcome to our fifth event organizer webinar of the year, Staffing and Course Safety. Today we have Bonnie Walker, USA Cycling's Technical Director, and Bill Koch, Executive Director of the Tour of America's Dairyland. During today's webinar, please feel free to utilize the Q&A box to ask any questions. And we will either, write out the answer, or we can also answer verbally, depending on what the question is, so everyone hears. Just let you know as well, today's webinar will also be recorded, and we will upload the webinar to our YouTube channel after this. So to further ado, I'm going to let Bonnie and Bill Koch take over. So enjoy the webinar today, everybody.
Thank you, Matt. Bonnie, I guess I'm talking first, right? Oh boy. Anyway, I'm the executive director and one of the partners for the Quick Trip Tour of America's Dairyland. As many of you know, hopefully all of you know, we're an 11-day criterium series, and I emphasize the word criterium because the information that we're going to be chatting about today is really very crit focused. Bonnie will have some backup stuff and things like that concerning road races, but we are all crits at this point in time in our lives. 15 years we've been putting on Toad now. Anyway, so it will be criterium-based information. And I think that the other thing that's really important to know as I begin is that the information that we're going to go through on the following slides is really a summative of a lot of conversations that I've had personally, and I've had with other race directors, team directors, and riders, and collecting information that makes a bike race and a bike race course safe and able to handle the riders who are on the course, the pedestrians around the course, the crosswalks, everything that goes with the race itself. So it's a work in progress. There's a document that we put together last year. We kind of kicked off this whole thing when we presented at the National Association of Professional Race Directors annual conference in early November, I believe that was, in Washington, D.C. And we had a panel there to talk about all these things. So really, these are best practices. These are things that are being used. These are things to be considered. There's no golden answers to a lot of them. And I'm sure, as many of you probably know who are on this call, and I have no idea who's on this call, by the way, you've crossed over some of these paths already or do every year when you put on your event or thinking about putting on events. So I guess we could start with slide 1, Matt or Bonnie. So the first thing, I broke it down really into 4 different slides. One we call criterium course design. The second one we refer to as fencing and the considerations you take there. The third one is course prep and setup. The fourth one is race management. And there's a lot of detail in race management, but anyway, we'll go step by step here. And one thing that everybody probably knows is the course length for a criterium race is a minimum of 1 kilometer or about 0.62 miles. They can be any length you really want them to be, but the idea there is to enhance spectator and sponsor experiences and to minimize the disruption to businesses and residents. You want to keep it shorter rather than longer. That's how we march. That's not everybody probably has that same opinion, but again, based on your mission and what you're trying to accomplish with a community, it's community engagement. I mean, there's so many things besides just the race that come into it. And the shorter the course, really the better for visibility and disruption, minimizing disruption. The other thing you want to look at when you're designing a course is the flow of the race. And that's, it's easy to put on a rectangular type of race, but just envisioning what the flow might be. And I think the other thing that's really, really important is the types of racers you're going to have on the course. So, you could be a pro-only event and have Pro 1, 2 elite riders out there. They can handle courses and much more technical courses a lot easier than novice racers who possibly are doing a race for the very first time. And for some of you on this call, maybe a majority of us on this call, we hold a variety of races all day long. So we have novice races at Toad, we have masters races at Toad, we have hand cycle races at Toad, we have pro races at Toad. So, we're constantly looking at them from all of those viewpoints and determining what kind of course we want to have. Conditions of the roads, everybody knows about that too. Are there, spots where there's a lot of potholes, where there's cracks in the pavement, those types of things, and how is that going to impact the riders? We don't all have the luxury of going to our community and saying, hey, can you fix this section of road? You need to repave it for us because we're going to have a bike race. That doesn't work very often. So you have to try to look at that and say, can we race with these conditions? And if not, is our partner willing to make some accommodations to us by the time we get to race day? And then the start finish shoot, that's really a key part of the course design. It's going to be narrower there generally if you have a truss. You want the final 200 meters ideally free of turns or curves. Again, pro riders are different than novice riders, but generally we look for a straight stretch of about 200 meters before and maybe 75 to 100 afterwards. And then it should be about 8 meters wide. Again, a lot of this particular part of it is really more pertinent to our setup and the trusses that we use, but you don't want them free flowing in a course that's five pavement sections wide, and you've got riders all over the road coming up from all over Hell's Half Acre. Similar to driving on a highway in Atlanta, right? When you've got 6, 7, 8 lanes and you have no idea where the other cars are coming from. So it's really a similar thing. I just made that up, by the way, but it sounds pretty good. Twilight races are different also. You've got to look at your existing infrastructure as far as lighting goes. We had a case many years ago where we had a race. We saw where all the lights were. We ordered all of our light trees. And then by the time the night came along, one of the light posts in a corner didn't work. So look at it during the night and look at it during the day. And the last thing that's really, really important is not only walk the course or drive the course, but really go out there and ride the course. And ride it, again, it helps to have a variety of a couple people who have different perspectives on how that course is going to flow on a bicycle. So anyway, that's it for that slide. Fencing. This is a big topic these days. A lot of accidents happen, whether they happen because of fencing. Fencing is going to be involved because if you've got fencing on your course and there's a crash, a lot of times that crash is going to go into the fence. Not always, but oftentimes it does. So when you're out there looking at your course again, you're trying to figure out where do you need fencing. You need to know what you're going to use that fencing for. Are you using it for crowd control? Or are you using it to direct the flow of the race? We generally like to think of it as crowd control. We'll talk a little bit about where it's placed and all that stuff in a second, but you can use it to flow the race traffic, but you really have to be thoughtful in how you do that, in terms of how you direct riders into a corner sometimes, or coming out of a chicane or something like that. The types of fencing are wide, and you've got the angled barricade type fencing. That's what we use on our start finish stretch. And then you've got the more vertical fencing. We typically like to think of it as the white fencing that's got a lot of potential slats in it. Those are the two most common fences that are used. There is some other fencing. If you go to Europe and look at some of the races over there, they've got some different styles of fencing that are used as well. But those are the two most common types of fencing you'll see at races in the United States. How much of it is needed? The question is, where do you put it? Are you going to fence off your entire course? Are you going to pick sections of it? If you've got an area that is virtually no pedestrians, there's no spectators, there's nothing going on down there, do you need fences down there too? People might have a different opinion on that. We tend not to fence those areas, but we'll fence the corners. We'll fence any area where there's a street intersecting with it, and we'll chat about that in a minute as well. Where there's crosswalks, certainly you want some sort of fencing there to control where people are crossing. But for most of us on this call, the affordability of fencing off an entire course is just not possible. It's not, you can't even really afford it. Where do you put the fencing? On or off the street? We say off the street. That is, you've just got to have it outside of the corners. You want to have it on a curb that creates they get a visual of how the corner is going to place, but you don't want it on the street where you can avoid that. Now, when you come to your start-finish chute, obviously all the barricade fencing is going to be on the street to form the chute, but that's generally the guideline that we will use. There's another question: should it be tied together or should it not be tied together? Again, it depends on where you're at. Generally, you want those pieces together. You're trying to avoid anybody hitting a blunt end of a fence, right? That's really, really important thing for safety. I mean, there's been serious injuries, there's been deaths caused by stuff like that. So you want those pieces to be together for the most part, but are there better ways to tie it together rather than a zip tie? Some people would say yes, some would say no. If you've got an emergency situation and you need to get an emergency vehicle onto the course, how do you get them onto the course if the course is totally locked down? That's a question to keep in mind. And then the other thing is, if you do have a crash and you've got, let's say, a line of fencing that's 20 or 30 long, and those things are all tied together, you're going to have that fence going down straight down the street like dominoes. And if you've got spectators behind them, it's just something you'll really want to consider. So I don't have the magic answer to that. It's a work in progress again, but there's a lot of different ways you can look at that. And then I think another thing that's really you can accomplish a lot with is covering as much of your fence, if not all of it, with coroplast, scrim, something that's going to prevent or minimize the amount of the opportunities that a rider has to put an arm and a leg or a head or something like that through that fencing or their bike. So covering as much of that fence as you can with some sort of material is really, really important. And then while you're doing that, the other thing you really want to think about is wind conditions. And is the wind going to impact the stuff that you've got covered? So if you're covering, you also want to have some sort of weight control behind that. Okay, Matt. Course prep and setup. Course inspection. This is day of race stuff. And again, I think probably all of us know how to do all this stuff, but it's just a good reminder. And I think when we started this panel or this committee on course safety with NAPRD, we really wanted to take a look at everything that comes into play when you're talking about having a safe course and having a safe race flow. So again, a lot of this stuff is things that you already know about. But day one, you show up in the morning, you got to check out the course, see what's going on. Are there cars parked on the course? If the cars are moved, some of the cars, probably all heard about the Downer Avenue race. Last year was its 45th year. The backside of that course, those cars are parked there all year long. I mean, it's very, very rare that there's a straight stretch that's moved, so you could put a sweeper in there or something like that. So come race day in June, that's about the only time of the year where there are no cars on that back stretch. So you could have debris back there, dust, gravel, all kinds of things that have to be swept up. You'd like to have that done in advance before you get there. Where are you placing your crosswalks? There are really particular spots and where you best want to put a crosswalk. And actually I have some notes that I'm referring to here, but going into corners, you want it in front of the corner. You don't want it on the back side of the corner. Why? Because on the other side of the corner, you can't tell where the race is coming from. So you definitely want it on the front end of the corner. Or well down the street. Anywhere that you've got a really good sight line on the race flow is where you want your crosswalks placed. Padding or hay bale placement. We pad a lot of trees, fire hydrants, rock structures, street ornamentation. There's all kinds of things out there that you'd prefer your riders not to hit. If they're coming out of a corner, you definitely want those things covered. Some people use hay bales in front of them. Try to keep those off the road if you can. Some people will pad. We'd use a lot of padding and very little hay bales, but we have used both. Use of cones are really helpful in calling out corners. If you've got an inside turn, you're going to have your fencing again off that curb, back a little ways, but having some orange cones there that are sort of just pointing out where that curb line is a great visual for the riders when they're coming into that turn. Not out in the road, but just pointing out the edge. So this is another crazy thing that can happen, but we had a race in East Troy 2 years ago, and the cones were off the road, a little over past the curb, but a rider's pedal in that stroke just came through and hit one of the cones. The cone went up in the air and out into the road. He just had his pedal just at the right point where it could clip that cone, even though the cone was beyond the curb. So his tires, his wheels didn't hit the curb, but his pedal extended over it. So again, just a good example of where you want to place those cones when you're doing it. Securing intersecting streets, alleys, and driveways, that speaks for itself. You're trying to remind residents in a community that they should not leave a driveway, that there's a race going on. You've got residential communications that happen. We like to say 3 times, 2 months, 2 weeks, 2 days before the race. But coning those driveways is another sort of last minute warning that there's something happening, can save some unfortunate accidents from happening. And then just having alleys and streets covered with fencing, and ideally having a volunteer there too. I mean, volunteers make everybody's life a lot easier. Lighting towers, that's, we talked a little bit about that, so I'll go on to the next slide from there. And then race management. There's a lot of stuff in here. One of the things that we talk a lot about is having an emergency action plan. We're very proud of the emergency action plan that we've had going on for many, many, many years. Our former medical providers actually started that process and have managed it ever since, actually. One guy still does it even on his own free time. But that emergency action plan is going to list who your first and second responders are. It's going to mandate that there are pre-race meetings. This is just what we use. We invite the police, the fire, the USA Cycling official, whoever our local volunteer coordinator is, our own race volunteer coordinator, our race director, and a representative from our medical team. So those meetings happen every day about an hour before the first race, and it just finalizes the plan of the day should anything happen. There's a lot of different things that go into an emergency action plan. There's things like, what do you do in case of lightning, tornadoes? For some of you obviously hurricanes play a big part in our race, in our environment these days. Anything that might happen, there's a see something, say something section in there. If there's something that just looks a little strange, you don't want to just assume it's going to go away. You want to do something about it. It has the day's race schedule in it. It has the race course map in it. If anybody ever wants to see a copy of our EAP, we're always happy to share that with you. But it's just really a lot of great information in there that spells out what you're going to do over the course of the day and who to call if something goes wrong. Radio distribution, who gets a radio, who doesn't get a radio. Again, that's up to you, but those are really critical for communications. In some cases, you get in a big city and radios don't, the wavelengths just don't work well between buildings or through buildings. So you've got to have a alternate plan in place, like cell phones and things like that, to make sure your communications are consistent and constant all day long. Medical team placement is important. Where are you going to put them that's going to allow them to get to as many points of the course as quickly as possible. You just really have to think about that in advance. Wheel pit placement. The inside of an exiting corner is a great place for it. We usually put it down in front of the start-finish area, 150, 200 meters. Crash protocol. Big thing. When is a race neutralized and by whom? A lot of us will have the community where if there's a 911 call and the race hasn't been neutralized yet, that fire department or police officer in a corner is going to want to open up the course and let let the emergency vehicles come onto the course while the race is going on. You cannot let that happen. They have to understand that USA Cycling officials they've got the first duty, which is to stop that race or neutralize that race before any emergency vehicles can come on the course. We've had a lot of heated arguments and discussions with some of our communities on how that whole thing works, but all they have to do is see it or hear about an example once, and they'll understand why that's really important. And making sure that everybody in that morning meeting is on the same page, that if something happens that we need to neutralize the race, you've got to wait for us to do that before you bring anybody on. And then where are your designated emergency access points? There's a fire. We've only had, in 15 years, we had a fire on the course, and a fire truck had to come on the course, 2 fire trucks actually. But making sure that they understand there should be, if you're using an overhead truss, you've got to make sure there's 2 points of access, one from each side of that truss, because the time it takes to take that truss down or get it out of the way for an emergency vehicle to come through there, maybe it's just precious moments that you don't really have. So you want to really designate a couple of access points, and then make sure your volunteers are aware of where those access points are going to be. Pace car versus moto gets talked about a lot. We use pace car. There's some courses that are super, super tight. You may not want a pace car, and a moto may be your best bet. I think, I mean, if you use motos, that's fine. I mean, Trish, I'm sure has been in plenty of races where moto is the lead vehicle. But again, make sure you have a good understanding with your officials on how the race flow is going to happen and what the duties are of the pace car, and then making sure your pace car driver is really experienced and knows what to do, and understands the direction that he or she may be given by the officials in the case there's the field is going to be lapped and you've got to pull over for a minute and let the field come through. There's a lot of different things that go on in that course, and they just have to make sure you're really experienced and understand how the flow. It's not just getting in a car and going out for a joy drive. They have to be on the entire time. Okay, next slide. Maybe that's the last slide.
What's your last one?
God
So I think
darn.
Matt said, I think you want to do my part. So I think Matt said we would do questions at the end. So if you guys have anything that you want to ask Bill regarding that, just hold on to it or put it in chat, and we'll get those questions asked and answered for you. So I'm Bonnie Walker. I am the technical director for USA Cycling, and I am going to try to tie in with what Bill said, but from an official's perspective and how we kind of work to help from a safety perspective. Again, my stuff is really tied more to crits, simply because I knew that's what Bill's was developing. All right, let me, if I can get my slide to go forward. There we go. So how did the organizers and the officials work together? So it's really all about collaboration. I think most of you on this call will agree that if you don't have a good working team between yourself and the officials, that it can be a little bit difficult to be successful. So from an organizer perspective, the organizer is responsible for the whole event. I mean, it's their race. They've been working on it for a long time, some weeks, some months, probably years for most of these events that go on year after year. The planning never really stops happening. And as Bill mentioned earlier, the organizer is responsible for all things related to the event, and it can be from the course design and setup, to the safety measures that were put into place, to the placement of porta potties, all those glamorous jobs, to where registration is going to be, and essentially the overall flow of the event. If you don't have a good flow, then things they kind of happen, but maybe not as smooth as we'd like to see them. So what we like to say is the organizer essentially has the keys to the event. It's their event, they've developed it, it's their baby. Where the officials come in, we like to say that we're the experts serving cycling. So we're bringing to the table what you can do from a cycling perspective, We ensure that the race and the organizer are meeting and respecting all the regulations that are put in place. And this can be whether it's a USA Cycling event, whether it's a UCI event, or even a world championship. We're coming in to help make sure those guidelines are being met. And they're also there to ensure a safe and fair racing environment as it pertains to the competition side of things. So we want riders to walk away from your event saying, hey, that was a great event. It was safe. The right riders won, that type of stuff. So I guess the bottom line on them trying to say is that we are all on the same team. We work together to resolve issues, including what changes we may see and identify what we need to change and why we would need to change them. So I think that's a two-way street when we get to the actual event or leading into the event. So there's a few things from an official's perspective. We talk about our pre-event discussions. So this would be something that should be taking place. Hopefully some of you are experiencing this. I'm sure not everybody does, but this is something we try to instill into our officials' crews. The chief ref should always be reaching out to that organizer, whether it's the moment they've been assigned or it's several months in advance or even earlier. We don't want them to go too long into the process before the event because we want to start those discussions early. So kind of review the concerns from any of the previous events that they've had, whether that's from a discussion that they had with the previous chief referee, whether that's things the race director has on his plate or her plate that they would like to make sure we don't have happen again. Essentially just anything that we can do to kind of improve upon the previous year's version. If there's a tech guide for the races, a lot of this is more tied to stage races, but there are some national level crits that do tech guides as well. You should be reviewing it as a chief referee, reviewing it, providing feedback to the race organizer. And ideally, this would be before this is published. I know a lot of the times as a chief referee, some of my experience has been is I found the tech guide online and before I even had a chance to look at it. So something to keep in mind is always, if it's nothing more than just to say, hey, here's our tech guide, let me know if you see anything that we need to update or change. That's always a good protocol to have in place with your chief referee. Things that we would be looking at from the official side is just the general course layout. A lot of it's a little tough to see when you're not on site, but usually there's a course map in there. You can identify where the pit's going to be set up, where staging's going to take place. Maybe you see something right off the bat that's a concern of yours, and that would be a great time to have that discussion with the race director. Understand what the process is for staging and call-ups. Bill talked about having that staging area set up. One of the things as an official I like to know, are we doing call-ups before the start of the event? And if we are, who's responsible for those? As well as what the process is. Are we gonna bring the riders in that we're calling up from a different area? Like, are they coming from the front of the field as opposed to trying to fight to get to the front, that type of thing? And then one of the things that Bill also touched on that I like to understand is what the severe weather protocol is going to be. Normally that would be in the tech guide. If you don't have a tech guide, that's something we need to discuss as far as, okay, what happens in the event of weather? Who's making those decisions? Usually it's a committee that gets pulled together on race day that talks about what's happening and what the plan is going forward. So it's always good to have those discussions in advance. You can identify any of the additional resources that are going to be available to you and your crew on race day. One of the key ones I like to know is, do we have neutral support, or who's handling that mechanical support in the pit areas? Another big thing of mine is, if there's mechanics in that pit, are they licensed mechanics? I know a lot of our neutral support programs only work with licensed mechanics, and that's kind of what we want to hear. A lot of crits will use more of a local bike shop top place. So we kind of just want to know who we're working with as we go into the event. Bill mentioned pace cars. I'll also mention, do we have VIP? Are we doing VIP rides? If we're doing VIP rides throughout the course or throughout the races, is there a designated location? Who's going to manage that? And then also, I say TV, but this could just be like a live feed. who are we providing? I mean, what information do they need from the officials to make this successful? A lot of times this comes back to the organizer themselves as far as getting the data, or maybe the timing companies providing it, but just to have an understanding of what's going to be on site, just so that we're all in sync when we get there on race day. The other thing I like to do in advance is identify the key staff and what their contact information is. Just so that we know, mainly for me, obviously the organizer, I'm going to know in advance. I also like to know who's responsible for the course. Do we have a course director assigned? Who's that one person, if there's a problem, I can reach out to on race day and they'll get it taken care of? I think that's very, very critical. And then on the actual race day itself, there's some things I like to do before the start. Bill talked about his meeting that he has an hour before, and I think that's great. That's kind of on my list of things as well. So meet with the organizer, review any last minute items, meet with the medical team, make sure they understand. Even if we've had like a big group meeting, it's always nice to go over and have the official introduce themselves to whoever's in charge of medical, just so you kind of put a face with a name. Just make sure everybody's on the same page as far as how the information is going to be reviewed and received, and what the expectations from that is. And a lot of that is also when we talk about, there's a crash on course, which I'll get into on the next slide, but how that process is going to work. Maybe meet with security outside of that initial meeting, just to say, hey, hi, I'm Bonnie Walker. I'm the chief rep of the race. If you have any concerns with riders or otherwise, please let me know. And then always have a pre-race meeting with your officials crew. And one of the reasons we do that is just to kind of make sure that we set the expectations for the day. So here's what's critical. They all know what the schedule is going to be like. They all know what race they're at, but sometimes there's a discussion about how things are going to be run. How are we going to use the motors? Are we going to use the motors in every race? Are we going to be pulling riders? That type of thing. So it all feeds into that flow of the race. On the management plan, this is, again, Bill talked about kind of as it pertains to the incident reporting. What's the notification process for medical? How are they going to access the course? That type of information. Again, we have a little bit of an overlap, but I think the fact is that the organizers and the officials are in sync on some of this stuff as far as what's important. So I think this is very good. The last thing probably before we get the event started is we want to talk about, is the course secured? Are all the barriers still in place? Are the course marshals set? I skipped one, sorry, the course walkthrough, which Bill mentioned also. Obviously you want to arrive early, the officials do. They want to do a course walkthrough with the course director, just see if there's anything that they see that's concerns. Riders are always riding the course in the morning. They may have concerns. They're going to bring it to the officials, and it helps to have that course director there that they can also talk to about some of the things they're seeing. Again, making sure before you start, everything's set to go. And the last thing I like to do before I actually start the first race is I want my motor referee to ride around the course ahead of the riders, give me an all clear, we're good to go, everything looks good, course marshals are in place. I also want that okay to come from the organizer. Hey, we're all ready to go. Is there anything we need to hold for? And so like Bill, in your case, you'd be the last person, or your course director be the last person I'd say, hey, are we good to go? Okay, during the event, so once the race starts, I'm going to take those keys away from Bill, but I'm going to have a short leash on them back to him. But essentially, once the race starts, you're now handing your baby over to the officials to run it, and you've got your fingers crossed saying, please don't screw this up. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but our job is to supervise and manage the sporting element of the race. So essentially making sure we have a safe and fair race, right? Like I mentioned earlier, making sure the correct riders win, making sure we avoid any sort of incidences that we can, that's under our control. And I guess the big thing is incident management. So what happens when we have a crash? So from an official's perspective, the first thing I'm going to want to know when a crash happens is the course clear. That's going to be my number one thing. It could just be where the whole field went down. There's no serious injuries. It's just somebody did something, the field went down, the course is not clear. There's no way if there was any riders that got off the front that they're going to be able to get through if they come back around. So is the course clear? One, do we continue to race? Do we need to stop the race or neutralize the race? And then the third thing is, do we need medical deployed? Usually the motor refs are very good. They're the ones who initially call in the crash when it happens. And usually one of them will sit there to wait to tell the chief referee the course is clear. We had a crash, course is clear, or course is not clear, that type of information. So it's that constant communication going back and forth. If fencing was involved, which seems to be a theme, as Bill mentioned, we've had a lot of issues with fencing over the last year or so. We always need to have a course inspection prior to a restart. So if a rider hit a fence, somewhere that's going to be bumped out of position. So we want to make sure the course director is able to get out there, take a look, reestablish the course if needed, and then give us the all clear that it's safe to restart. And again, since we stopped it, course was fixed, we would wait for that all clear. We would not proceed without hearing that. Okay, oops, I have after the start. This is actually after the finish, my apologies. What I'll do as a chief referee is kind of do my debrief. So one will be with the officials crew, identify any issues or concerns that they had, any questions that they have about how we ran the event, or problems that came up that they didn't know how to help. The other thing I asked them is there any information that you would like to provide back to the race director? So the race director and the official chief ref should be meeting at the end of their race, whether that happens that night. If it's late at night, it normally happens the next day or maybe within the next week. But you want to have that debrief with the organizer just to let them know, okay, here's the things I saw, or here's the things I think we can do better on, or hey, this was great. I loved how you managed your medical team. They were top notch. We didn't have any issues with them at all. And then the last thing is to make sure that we get the first report of occurrences done. So this is essentially when crashes happen, a rider's transported. We want to make sure we have some sort of documentation from a USA Cycling perspective that identifies who that person was. It doesn't have to be perfect, but if we can say what happened, what time it happened, did a rider hit another rider? Was there a pedestrian that walked out onto the course and a rider struck the pedestrian? It's all that information that we would, that this rider or this person that had the crash would need some sort of medical attention. I don't really, from my perspective, if they fall down, they have road rash and they're treated, I don't really care about that. To me, that's just normal. It's more like broken bones, transported, heat exhaustion, that type of stuff. Went down, they feel fine, their helmet was cracked. I definitely wouldn't want a recurrence report on that. So we would complete those along with collecting the rider releases for each of those incidents. And that's something that Chief Ref will file with their post-event paperwork. One thing that's important to note is that you would think as USA Cycling, we'd have access to all those online signed releases from Bike Reg, but unfortunately we only have that for our own events. So that is something that we would get from the race organizer or the crew that they have in place to handle the registration. One of the things I wanted to talk about on the first report of occurrences is who's actually responsible for filling those out. So it can be a shared responsibility. At some of the bigger crits, we'll hand over a stack of occurrence reports to the medical team, and they'll do their pass of it and hand them back to us at the end of the day. And then the chief ref will gather that and submit that on behalf of the organization. A rider could come or an official out on course notices a crash. They're the ones who complete the occurrence report, or somebody may come up to the race organizer and say, hey, I was out warming up and I hit a pothole and went down and it broke my arm. And at that point, the organizer would complete that report, or they would delegate that to someone on their staff, or maybe they would bring it to one of the officials to let them know. But regardless, somebody has to fill that out. It's not up for us to go off and like try to figure out what happened. It's just like we just need to write down what happened as much as we know and make sure that gets in the hands of the chief referee, if it's not an official already, to turn in with the post event. All right. So Matt, I'm going to turn this back over to you to see if there's any questions from our audience today.
Yeah, definitely. I haven't seen any come in yet, but we will hold on for a moment just to make sure if anybody's typing, it comes through properly. But while we're waiting for that, I just want to let you know that again, this was recorded, so we will be putting it up on our YouTube channel. So you can share it with anybody who might have missed this, or you feel like the information is very pertinent to them. And then also after this, there is a survey when you log off. So please, if you have a chance, takes only a couple minutes, just let us know how we did, what you're looking for in other webinars in the future. And then from there, our next and our last webinar of the year is scheduled for November 19th on clubs and collegiate programs. So we'll just wait a quick moment and see if any questions come in. But I definitely want to thank Bill and Bonnie for their presentation and letting us all understand how they're working officials and how their events are put on and just best practices. So
It must have been perfect, Bonnie.
Except for that last slide.
I just got to thank you from Paul Reardon. Thank you, Bill and Bonnie. You two are truly awesome and the best in the business. So,
Wow.
and then Robert Laybourne says thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
And Rob didn't have any questions, Bill.
And Rob Laybourne didn't have any questions. I'm really disappointed. He was texting me though during the webinar, so.
Giving you some
Saw my eyes go off in a different direction. It was Rob.
All right, I think that'll be all. So again, thank you for being on, Bonnie and Bill. And thank you for everybody else tuning in for the webinar. Again, this is recorded and it'll be up. So I hope everybody has a great rest of your day.
You too. And Trish, thanks for being my backup.
Oh, actually, I have one quick question from Tim. What is the most common mistake event directors make?
Oh boy.
What have you seen in the past, maybe in your beginnings, Bill, or?
The most common mistake. I'm sure there's lots of them. This is from Tim, you said?
Yes. Tim Radcliffe.
I should have had this thing to ponder for a while. I don't know. You know what I think it is? I think it's our closer scrutiny of weather conditions that can change how we set up our fencing every day, especially knowing that we have 11 days in a row, right? So we see everything. I mean, there's not thank God we've never seen it. We did have a tornado warning once, but just the way the fencing is secured, I think is probably the most frequent thing. And I'm not saying it's not secured, but trying to look down the road to say, okay, we're there at 7 in the morning and we're going to be there till 8:30 at night. So what are we going to encounter during the course of the day that could change what we're doing? And the other thing is, Tim, is your course designed for the early races, which are usually the novice races? So we generally structure ours where the beginners start at the front of the day, and then we advance through the day with our our higher category, our lower category riders, but better riders. So how the race course flows is also going to change at times. So how are you going to accommodate that change midstream once the day's moving. You know, if you see that they're coming further out in a corner or something like that, and you say, oh, well, we've got a tree that's really exposed down the road that would never come into play in a novice race, but it might come into play in a pro race. I mean, I think those are the things that we can always do a better job of.
So there is another question here from Travis asking, what can USA Cycling do to help first-time race promoters? And my answer to that is your regional manager. We have 3 of them across the country. That would be kind of your first line of who to go to help, and they can give you resources. The other thing I think is to work very closely with your chief referee. And Bonnie gave a lot of information about that communication ahead of time. And so once you know who your chief referee is, I would start to utilize them as much as you possibly can to help make your event as successful as it can be.
We also do have an event organizer webpage on USA Cycling with a bunch of articles and standard operating procedures for your events, from course safety to how to market your event and everything. So after this, I can send that link out to everybody to let you look over that. So
I would add too, though, Travis, if you're, some of the bylaws and rules are changing, but you might consider joining a group like the NAPRD, because we are opening, the association was initially formed around the PRT series that USA Cycling put on, but it's much more open today to pretty much any road race director who wants to join a promoter. And just networking with other promoters is so valuable. And as everyone on this page has said, collaboration and great relationships with your USA Cycling officials is, they're like your partner. I mean, we've gained so much from having a good working relationship with them over the years, and they can help you a tremendous amount. So I think both of those avenues are open to you, and you should definitely pursue those.